organizations that totally stand against the gospel and the mission of Jesus, and yet pretty much even here in our hometown, our churches have been silent. Our church members have been silent. Whether it's not voting, not being vocal in their community, standing up for what they believe is right. Predominantly, we see our churches almost sitting on their hands, not willing to do something that even though they feel strongly about. Ann Golder, in her writing about our views of apathy, says that it is true that apathy kills democracy, and we are heading in that direction. Speaking of her own Australia, like most of our rights, their true value is only obtained when they are used. See, as a country, when we sit on our hands when we need to speak out, if our apathy gets to us, we then in turn lose our rights. We see conflicts right now, even in our own culture and society, to take away our right to bear arms, to take away our rights to free speech and freedom of religion, mainly because of our apathy in standing up for our rights as given to us by our founding fathers. In Proverbs chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, through the writer, God talks about this view of apathy. He says, "How long wilt thou sleep, O sluggard? When will you arise out of your sleep? Yet a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep." Speaks so much of our current culture and our society. And to think of, even in my generation, seeing my parents or even my grandparents being the most apathetic of them all, seeing the gross changes in our culture and society, and yet saying and doing nothing. I wonder how our founding fathers would view it, or even how God views it. If we are charged as being the people of God with being the influence for good in our communities, how can we stand by and see evil prosper? As we sit back and start to learn from history, I really have enjoyed this quote by Winston Churchill. "Those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it." A very common quote from Winston Churchill, and he himself really understood the value of looking at history. And as we look at history, not only in the context of world history, but also biblical history and the history of Israel. First, we see this idea of Israel and the quote-unquote god Molech. For those of you who do not know, Molech was a little bronze god about this big. They shaped it with his hands stretching out in front of him, and his belly was carved out. They would build a fire in his belly, and he would get red, fiery hot. And in the worship of Molech, they would sacrifice their babies into the arms of this god Molech. Now, God saw this coming. God saw this idol worship. And in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 3, he gives a command against specifically the worship of this particular god. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 3. "And I will set my face against that man, and I will cut him off among his people, because he has given his seed," or in other words, his children, "unto Molech, and defiled my sanctuary, and to profane my holy name." At this point in Israel's past, they had started to worship Molech, not just out in the city, but even in the temple of God. That even Solomon, later on, would build up a portion in the temple itself to the worship of this god Molech. And God would hold that country accountable for the blood of their children. What's interesting, even though God gave this commandment against the worship of Molech in Leviticus chapter 20, they violated the commandment at the warnings of multiple prophets, but specifically in Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 35. Jeremiah chapter 32, he sees what is going on in his nation, and he is appalled, like most of the prophets are appalled and continually preaching against their practices. In Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 35, he tells them, "And they built the high places of Baal, which are in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to cause their sons and daughters to pass through the fire into Moloch, which I commanded them not, neither came into my mind that they should do this abomination, and to cause Judah to sin." Once again, Israel had come and worshipped Moloch and bringing their sons and their daughters to be sacrificed, literally to be burned to death in the arms of this god. And yet, there were some, the prophets, who weren't apathetic, who would speak out. And yet the culture and the society, the rest of those that were listening, even though they may wanted to do something, did not stand up. Apathy caused the destruction of probably thousands or even hundreds of thousands of babies to die during this period. In modern culture, I would equate this to abortion. On a daily basis, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of babies are killed in the womb. Although the parents do not know that what they're doing is in relation to this god Moloch, but I see it as a direct worship of the same God, of the same hatred of mankind. So how do we fight this kind of apathy at home? How do we start to stand up as believers? How do we try and fight this in our communities? I think the key thing is remember Jesus in his primary mission. In Luke chapter 4, he comes to the synagogue on the Sabbath, and a scroll is presented to him, which is Isaiah. And he turns to the place in Isaiah chapter 61, starting in verse 1. Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 and 2. And Jesus reads this on the day that it's his first recorded sermon. "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings to the meek. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted and to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God, and to comfort all that mourn." Jesus stopped in his reading in Luke chapter 4 just before the judgment of our God. But what he preached that day, he continued throughout his ministry to bind up the brokenhearted, to comfort them, and to give freedom to those that were captive. That's how we fight apathy in our communities. If we truly take that mission of Jesus into our hearts and our minds, we are going to fight injustice. We are going to fight apathy in our churches. And maybe, once again, we can be like the early church in Acts chapter 2 and turn our world upside down. One of the key things to doing this is maybe not only through your churches, but finding your voice through outreach. How we can do to fight apathies in our communities is through joining other organizations of similar mind. Maybe you have a heart to fight against abortion. There's lots of organizations that goals are to end abortion. Or maybe you're against animal cruelty. There's tons of organizations for those. I'm sure that there is an organization or a ministry group or a church that is their banner. Join with them and standing up and removing the apathy not only from your home, but from your church and your community. As we see the church and our need to fight for complacency and a push on it to become the church, as we see it in Acts chapter 2, I believe that if we remove apathy, as we see in Acts chapter 2, we will once again be the church that turns our world upside down for Jesus. If we could see that in this time, just imagine the things, the ministry, the lives saved, and the glory that God will get in seeing his world turned upside down. Thank you.